There may be a relation here when we've had callers bring up the fact that it seems that there's no one inside Washington any longer willing to challenge the Clinton crime family. That's because I think our culture has moved to a point now where we are, I don't know, wussification might be the word to use. I heard a friend of mine use that years ago. He called a radio program I was hosting, and I thought, that seems to fit. It's somewhat of a made up word, but we all have a pretty good idea of what it means. This is from National Review, David French. David French, of course, is a war veteran and great writer. Has also worked in law as well. And men are getting weaker, it says, because we're not raising men. What is he referencing? Well, the Washington Post highlighted a study showing that the grip strength of a sample of college men had declined between 1985 and 2016. Indeed, the grip strength of the sample of college men had declined so much, from 117 pounds of force to 98, that it now matched that of older millennial women. In other words, the average college male had no more hand strength than a 30-year-old mom. 30 years ago, I remember being at a luncheon, and it was being sponsored by a local university, and being one of the local radio talking heads, I got invited, and I was talking to a man there. He probably, gosh, was in his 80s at the time, so he'd been around since, most of the century at the time. And he was telling me, he said, your handshake, your grip is always going to be a calling card for you wherever you go in life. And he was saying that when he was growing up as a young man, you don't have to break the other guy's hand, but you have to know, you have to give him a firm grip so that he understands that you're serious about things in life. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, he's putting too much into that. But you know what? Looking back on it, he had a lot of experience. He may well have known what he was talking about. French goes on to write, none of my nerdiness in high school relieved me, and he was in high school 30 years ago, relieved me of the responsibility of learning how to be a man, a protector, a builder, and a fixer. So that meant spending my Saturdays hauling out the ramps to change the oil and oil filters on all our cars. Do you remember that? We had these big red metal ramps, and I would actually get them out of the garage, unstack them, line them up, and then we would drive the front end of the automobile up on the ramp, balance it out, and then you would crawl underneath. And you would actually get underneath, pull that plug. Sometimes that plug, really, you had to put a lot of strain into that to get that thing loose and then drain the oil. And we had a little plastic bucket I would drain it into. And then what we would do is we would literally pour that oil down the center of the driveway, because in the middle of the driveway there was grass growing, and my dad said that the oil would help keep the grass out of the way. And by doing that, that we could get rid of the used oil and find a secondary use for it. And then a few years after all of that, the government came along and said you can't dump that oil out there, and now you have to recycle it. Of course, I guess they have to catch you first, right? He writes that meant helping my dad build a new back porch or constantly wrestling with immense piles of firewood. Same thing in my household. We only had a few cord on the porch, so when you got to a particular part of winter, I had to go all the way outside, loop around behind the other side of the barn, and then pick up wood over there. He says, I made extra money working in neighborhood yards. Being a guy meant doing manual labor. That was just part of growing up, no matter your social class. And then he says, in the age of instant oil change, ubiquitous lawn services, and on-demand handymen, privileged kids simply don't have the same naturally occurring opportunities to learn to work with their hands and to develop physical strength. I can remember so many times when I was just a wee lad having a shovel in my hand, working alongside my dad, and then helping him mix concrete and doing all of these other jobs he was always involved with. And it is true, you develop certain skills. And even though I was blind as a bat, I could still handle, hammers were a chore because of my eyesight. Having an issue driving a nail straight was sometimes tough. But that's when my dad was there. He'd bend it back out straight and finish the job for me if I got it wrong. But I'm telling you, we did all of those things at home. Nobody went to an oil change shop. Everybody changed oil at home. Now in some neighborhoods, you can't even do that. You're banned from doing it by the HOA. So no one has that opportunity. So it's fascinating to think that we are walking around now with men who don't have the hand strength that they used to, and that in fact it's about the same as the writer says, the average woman. Culturally, we have become a nation of wimps. That's why someone like Hillary Clinton gets away with what she gets away with, because no one, especially all of the fellow travelers, I mean, these are the ultimate wimps in media, You see a lot of them on TV, and you wonder when they gave up their man card. Did they have to do that in order to get the job? And I think that's why you don't have a lot of pressure, and people are so afraid of their own shadows or being accused of being sexist or racist or a bigot that they simply don't go forward and do these things. Or politicians used to talk bluntly. They don't do that anymore, other than Trump. And even Trump has been somewhat neutered in the last few weeks. Speaking of this, there's even more to tell you about. Yesterday, we mentioned West Virginia University making rules about calling people names. You can no longer call a girl, or you got to call her a woman, I guess, on campus, unless she thinks she's a man. And then you better call her a man, or you're going to get this, in serious trouble. Well, it's epidemic across campuses in this country. This is the latest from GOP USA. Found this shared this morning by Cal Thomas on Facebook, and the headline is Princeton bans the word man to prevent hurt feelings. Some wise guy on Facebook has also said, well, then they can't call it Princeton anymore because Prince would obviously refer to a man. A writer by the name of Michael Haverluck says Princeton University is banning the word in what it calls an effort to foster a more, quote, inclusive community, unquote. A policy that conservative critics contend is aligned with its campus politics that caters to the LGBT community. And again, when I was a kid, if I had heard LGBT, I would have thought lettuce, onion, and tomato, or lettuce, bacon, and tomato, but no, it means something else today. The acclaimed Ivy League university is readjusting its accepted campus terms to do away with words that could cause sensitive students, yes, sensitive students, faculty members, or school administration any bit of discomfort due to their gender preference. I can't go to the bathroom next to other men, so I'm going to use the ladies' room. And if you laugh at me, my feelings are going to be hurt, and you'll be expelled. Not stopping there, university officials are offering a new set of directives for those employed by the academic institution so that they employ proper terminology that should be used when communicating on campus at all times. Instead of using man, employees are told to use words such as human beings, individuals, or people. Yeah, this is the future. This is what's taking place across America, and these people are doubling down on their efforts to imprint this across the land. Telephone number to reach our program today, 736-0300. That's 736-0300. And you're on the air. You're on KLIX.
Good morning, Bill. This is Don, who had his share of blue fingernails. Bill, Trump and our side should get the list from Judicial Watch of more than 130 Clinton friends and associates who fled the country or pled the Fifth in order to avoid testifying in a criminal investigation. They fled after Clinton left office.
And the big part of that, too, is now that these people are gone, how come media isn't tracking them down? Wouldn't there be a story there? Wouldn't there be a story that you could... But see, even getting the story anymore now is subject. It's only about getting the story from one side. And you don't want to embarrass your girl if you're in the liberal media any longer. We have another caller with us. You're up next, and you're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Good morning, Bill.
Morning.
Do you remember, probably 30, 40 years ago, probably 40 actually, it was being bandied about that instead of being called a person, you were a parrot. Instead of it being a mailman, it was going to be an it. Instead of being a manhole, it was going to be an it-hole.
Well, I've met more than a few it-holes in the Democrat Party, but I guess you're probably right.
But it was a whole movement about it being non-gender. You were talking this morning, and I remembered that. We used to laugh about it, and we're back there again.
Here it is. That's a great point. You know, and when I hear, thank you for the call. When I hear these things, and yeah, we thought they were a joke at one point, and I still think they are. But the fact of the matter is, how are we going to continue as what is it? The one character says in the play and then the movie, inherit the wind. Wasn't there a lot of begatting going on? I mean, how are we going to have any begatting going on in the future? How are we going to have any more children if we all just suddenly become eunuchs? You're up next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story on KLIX. Go ahead.
Well, it's all about destroying our culture, either with the refugees or with the communist agenda there to destroy our culture. Make a unisex culture out there, and that's exactly what they're doing. But I wasn't able to get on last hour, but you're still talking about Hillary, and just remind folks that she was a big fan of Saul Alinsky, and a lot of people don't know who that name is, but she wrote a 92-page senior honors paper, had met with him many times. He was a radical community organizer. But the big deal is that he wrote a book called Rules for Radicals, and that's basically been the Bible or the guidelines for all of the socialist, communist activities in this country. And the bottom line is he dedicated that book to Lucifer, Satan. And so Hillary's been very skilled at following these Alinsky rules. And he said the trick is to penetrate existing institutions such as churches, unions, political parties. This is exactly what Hillary and Bill have accomplished to a great extent. But, it's the list of crimes of Hillary and Bill just goes on and on and on. It's not just the email thing. It's not Benghazi. It's, you've got Filegate, you've got
Yeah.
bimbo eruptions and so forth.
Younger
And
people don't even remember most of these.
yeah, and that's just the whole thing. And it's really sad now. We've got a good Christian movie called Ben-Hur coming out. We viewed that, and it's doing poorly at the box office because nobody knows about the story about Ben-Hur because the first movie came out in the late 50s. And so it was a tremendous 11 Academy Awards for the original Ben-Hur, starring Charlton Heston and so forth. The new movie is a little different twist on things, but it's a great story about conversion, faith, and forgiveness.
Right.
And anyway, but people, we've got to think twice about staying home or not voting. Trump is not perfect by any means, but he is standing up. I think he's a great, he loves this country, and I think that's important. Hillary would sell it to the highest bidder.
And she has. I thank you very much for the telephone call. I was going to go see actually Ben-Hur this past weekend, got tied up with some other things, and didn't make it, but it's still on my list. This remake, and of course there were some silent versions of it too, but I don't count those. This remake of the 1959 version is actually much more Christian in its orientation. Not that the Heston version wasn't, but this is much more. And apparently that's what's turning. Well, there's no Santa Claus in it, so I guess a lot of folks out there wouldn't understand the actual faith part of it. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Quick note, tomorrow morning on our program, just after 9 o'clock news, we're going to be joined by the new Economic Development Director for Twin Falls. He's been in town a few weeks and getting the lay of the land, and going to talk about where we go, what directions we now go, because I don't know that you can go too much more on the north side. I'm sure you can, but in other words, there's probably a number of different directions you can now go when it comes to development. We'll talk a little bit about that. Also, one of the representatives from the office of Dr. Jonathan Tripp, one of the medical pros, will join us between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. We do it every Wednesday morning. It's called Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. I do want to remind you that they're looking for new patients at Tripp Family Medicine. And also, if you didn't know this, you can often get in on the very same day. If you wake up in the morning and you have the rumbles or some other issue and you think you need to see the doctor or one of the other medical pros, give the office a call, and you can often be in as early as the afternoon on the very same day. Tripp Family Medicine is located on Fillmore Street in Twin Falls, directly across from the main post office. And remember, life's too short not to feel good. We were talking a little bit in the program about some of the ridiculous ideas being promoted by liberals across the United States. And, you wonder what would ever happen to a lot of these people if they were seriously challenged, especially with something like an economic downturn, because in their lives, you've got to remember, they think that what you call someone else, or, whether a man can wear a dress and use the girls' room, the little girl's potty. They think these are the biggest issues facing America today. $20 trillion dollars in debt is meaningless to them. But when it all comes down, folks, when it hits the fan, so to speak, then all of a sudden they're going to have to actually get serious about problems in this country. Came across this in the New York Times, which is the Bible of American liberalism. And some of you may have noticed this here, even in our area. As homeless find refuge in forests, anger is palpable in nearby towns. Now, if you recall, if you're old enough to remember the 1980s, and we had some homeless issues at the time, every night, all of the old alphabet networks were beating up President Reagan, telling you President Reagan was responsible for homeless people in this country. Now, when I was a kid, going all the way back 50 some years ago, they were called bums, and then the politically correct said, no, you've got to call them the homeless. And obviously, just describing everybody as a bum, that catch all term, probably wasn't fair. But still, a lot of them are people who are there because of their own behavior, but some just can't help it. The writer goes on to say to millions of adventurers and campers, America's national forests are a boundless backyard for hiking trips, rafting, hunting, and mountain biking. But for thousands of homeless people and hard up wanderers, they have become a retreat of last resort. Forest law enforcement officers say they are seeing more dislocated people living off the land, often driven there by drug and alcohol addiction, mental health issues, lost jobs, or scarce housing in costly mountain towns. If you actually just go out into the desert in some spots, you'll be amazed where you see people actually, they've parked their RVs and they've set up almost what you'd call permanent shop in some of these locations because it's just cheaper that way. Many years ago, I'm going back close to 20 years ago, I was working in a small town, well, relatively about the size, I guess, of Twin Falls, maybe a little larger metropolitan wise, city about the same size. And I was working and they had a place behind my house called South Mountain. Now, it really wasn't a mountain in the sense that we think of mountains in this part of the country, but it was pretty big for that part of the country, pretty big hill. And there was a great trail that would run up the side of it. And I used to like to come home from work and a little bit of my rest and relaxation. I had two dogs at the time. I had a Great Dane, and then I had a dog that he was the smaller of the two. He only weighed about 80 pounds. He was a mix of, I don't know, Shepherd and Golden Retriever and Collie. And I would take those two dogs out after work, and we would go walking up the trail on the mountainside. And I'll tell you, after a while, I started appreciating the fact I had the dogs with me while I was walking because I started running into people on the trail, and it was obvious they were living out there. Now, some of them may have been fugitives from justice. Others may have had those mental problems the writer here references, but they were people who were getting by out there. Whatever the reason that they were out there, I don't know. I didn't stand around and talk to them a lot, and most of them were extremely frightened when they saw my dogs. And they were it's a good thing they didn't know because I lived down at the on a what you call almost like a mesa, not quite at the bottom of that hill, but the trailhead came down just above my house. There was a small park, and then my house was just over the road. And I'm glad I had the dogs because the dogs likely kept people away from the house. And the folks living up on the mountain, the homeless, likely didn't know that my dogs would have helped them load the truck if they'd come by and decided to empty out all of my belongings. They were not vicious dogs, but because of their size, they apparently put the fear of God into some of these people. And so it was a good thing that I had them around. But that was a problem 20 years ago. And according to this story in the New York Times, it is far, far worse. So if you go wandering out in the well, let's say even in the South Hills, or you take off really anywhere in Idaho or some of our surrounding states now, you don't only have to be worried about bears and bobcats and mountain lions and other issues that may be out there. You got to be worried sometimes about the people you're going to be encountering. And they're all there because of Barack Hussein Obama's economy, for the most part. Yes, they may have mental issues, they may have some alcohol issues, but you can bet a lot of those issues were brought about by the stresses of living in modern America over these last 8 years. 9:30, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 63, and I want to thank you for joining us this morning. We've got more coming up in just a moment. Actually, I got a little some scientific news to share with you this morning. We don't do that a lot, but I've got something on the docket.